Hi everybody, welcome to another video. In this video, we're gonna finally start talking about the heart and the cardiovascular system, but really the next couple of videos in this playlist are gonna be focused just on the cardiac portion, and then we'll transition into the vascular part of the cardiovascular system, okay? Today's video is going to be about the anatomy of the heart, and then we'll talk about the path of blood flow, the structure of the walls of the heart, and we'll talk about valves and how they accommodate blood flow. Okay? So if you guys like the video, if you learned something from it, please like, comment, subscribe, and let's get to it. So first things first, this is not an anatomy course. It is a physiology playlist, so we're going to just briefly go through just the quick anatomy of the heart, just so we're all on the same page here. So you guys know that the heart actually has four chambers, right? Here's one chamber, here's another chamber, here's the third, and here's the fourth, okay? And these four chambers each have a name. The two top ones are called the atria, and the two bottom ones are called the ventricles, all right? The ventricles will actually pump blood to the structures in your body. So for example, this ventricle over here pumps blood to the lungs. This ventricle here pumps blood towards the rest of the body. Now, another cool thing that I want you to know is when you're looking at the heart right now, you might be thinking that this side of the heart is actually the left side and this side of the heart is actually the right side because, well, you're looking at it like this. But actually, that would be wrong. This side of the heart is the right side and this side is the left side. And you might be a little confused, and that's okay. The reason why this is the left side and this is the right side is because we're looking at the heart in an anatomical position, okay? And in the anatomical position, this would be the left side, okay? So imagine you're looking at another person head on. That's the anatomical position, okay? That's what we're looking at. All right. Now let's go ahead and start naming some of these structures in order. So this giant chamber here, this giant cavity, this giant chamber here, that's going to have a special name. That's called the right atrium. It's on the right side, so it's the right atrium. Okay? So that's the right atrium. Now, there is specific vessels that actually bring blood to the right atrium, right? Because you guys know the function of the heart is to pump blood towards the vasculature that surrounds it, okay? And by definition, that vasculature is going to carry that blood to specific organs, okay? So, for example, if it's on the right ventricle, it's carrying it to the lungs. If it's to the left ventricle, it's carrying it to every other organ in your body, okay? And we'll take a look at that. But this right atrium here, it receives blood from two places. It receives blood from this giant vein here called the superior vena cava, and this other giant guy called the inferior vena cava, because it's coming from the bottom, the superior vena cava coming from the top. Okay, well, that gives us a clue. That means that the superior vena cava is bringing blood back from the head and the arms, whereas the inferior vena cava is bringing blood from the lower body. And they're all dumping that blood straight to the right atrium. From the right atrium, that blood is going to have to move towards this little chamber here, which I said is called the ventricle. Specifically, it is called the right ventricle, because we're on the right side. But before it does that, it has to actually go through a valve, okay? This valve here, right over here, this guy, is called the tricuspid valve. So this is called the tricuspid valve. Okay, let's write it like this. And sometimes you might also see it be written as, let's remove this. Sometimes you might see it be written as the right atrioventricular valve. Okay? So the right, because it's on the right side, atria and ventricular valve, because it's separating the atrium and the ventricle, okay? But more commonly, you'll see it referred to as the tricuspid valve. And we'll see a little bit later why they call it tricuspid, okay? Now, the blood from the right atrium will go through this tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Then where does the blood go? Well, then the right ventricle is going to have to squeeze and pump this blood over here in the only direction it can go. Some of you might ask, well, why doesn't the blood just kind of go back towards the right atrium? And that's a great question. Something that I'll briefly touch on is that this valve right here, alongside this valve on the other side, they have these things, these little tendinous cords attached to them. Okay? These guys are called the chordae tendineae. And the chordae tendineae are actually they're attaching to this valve, okay? And they're holding that valve in place. And there are these special muscles that actually hold on to the tendinous cords. These are called your papillary muscles, okay? We have them right here. So these are called your papillary muscles. And essentially, when the ventricle contracts, these guys, these tendinous cords, they actually hold on to this valve extremely tightly due to the papillary muscles contracting. And this actually prevents the valves from backflowing in this direction. All the valves are just little flaps, okay? So you can imagine the valve is like this when it's closed, but if the ventricle contracts and these chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles weren't there, what would happen is that the blood would hit this so forcefully that it would actually cause this flap to kind of open up and allow for the blood to actually go back towards the right atrium. So the presence of this chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles prevents the regurgitation of blood back towards the right atrium by keeping the actual valve closed. Great. So let's follow that path of blood again. The blood that was in the right ventricle has to get pushed to this giant vessel here. But before it does that, it has to go through another valve. What is this valve called? This valve is actually called the pulmonary semilunar valve. And the reason why it's called semilunar is because it's got a half of a moon shape, right? So it's semilunar, and it's a valve. But why pulmonary? Well, that's a great question because it's actually the valve that lets the blood go towards the pulmonary artery. Okay? The pulmonary artery. And let's write it like this. Pulmonary artery. Right here. This big blue structure here. Okay? That's the pulmonary artery. This is the left side. That's the right side. Okay? So the pulmonary semilunar valve opens up and brings the blood towards the pulmonary artery, which will then go out to the lungs, or the pulmonary circulation, to get oxygenated. Okay, so once that happens, the blood has to come back to the heart, to the left ventricle. Okay? Well, where is the left ventricle? Right over here. This chamber right here is the left ventricle. But hang on a minute. Before the blood goes to the left ventricle, it has to go towards this guy, the left atrium. Okay, the left atrium. All right. You see how it's pretty much the exact same thing on both sides? Right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. Okay. So where is the blood actually coming back from? Well, it's coming to the heart via this vein called the pulmonary vein. Okay. And the pulmonary vein, you can see there's two here and then there's two here. Okay. And if you could look at a view of the heart from behind, you can see that this guy actually circles around the heart and then dumps the blood into the left atria over here. Okay? And again, the pulmonary vein brings oxygenated blood back to the left atrium from the lungs. Okay? Don't be confused by the fact that it's a vein and it's an artery here. Okay? The oxygenation is a bit different when we talk about the pulmonary circuit. Now, once the blood is in the left atrium, it's going to have to go towards the left ventricle, but it has to go through another set of valves. What is this valve called? This valve has like three names. You can call it the bicuspid valve, okay? The bicuspid valve. You can also call it the mitral valve, or you can call it the left atrioventricular valve, okay? Awesome. And again, we'll talk about why it's bicuspid and tricuspid. Okay. Once that blood is in the left ventricle, it'll get pumped out. It'll get pumped out towards this big giant vessel, okay? But before it does that, it has to go through another set of valves, which is kind of hidden behind this, uh, pulmonary artery. But you can see it right here. These valves right there, those are called your aortic semilunar valve. Okay, so they're still semilunar valves, but now they're called aortic. And why? Well, that's because they are found inside of the aorta. Okay, the aorta. So this giant artery is called the aorta. Okay. If you want to be very specific, this is actually the ascending aorta and this is the aortic arch, okay, before it goes back down to this descending aorta. And then, of course, you have these other ones here. You got the brachiocephalic, you got the left common carotid, and the subclavian. Now, that's all of the kind of landmarks that I want you to know about. One other thing I want you to know is that we know that the left atria, or in general, the atria and the ventricles are separated by their respective valves. Okay, and the ventricle and their respective arteries and veins are actually separated by, not veins, their respective arteries, they're separated by these other kind of valves, okay? What separates the two ventricles from one another? Well, what separates the two ventricles from one another is this big, beefy structure right here, which is called the interventricular septum. And inter means in between two objects or something. And ventricle, well, because it's separating these two ventricles. It's in between those two ventricles. So it's the interventricular septum. Okay, that's great. Now, and of course, you can't see it in this image, but there is an interatrial septum as well that separates the two atria. Okay, now that we're clear about the anatomy that's going on with the heart, okay, we can take a look at some of these structures and some of the characteristics of the arterial and the venous system. But very quickly, I don't want you guys to get confused that this is all of the heart, okay? That's not actually true. The heart has many layers, okay? So we're only showing, for example, the muscular layer, okay? This layer right here is called the myocardium, okay? It is the actual muscle or the wall of the heart, the muscular wall of the heart, the myocardium. That's what that's called. So myo meaning muscle, cardia for the heart. But there are other layers, okay? So for example, there is a endocardial layer inside, and then there is a pericardial cavity with a parietal layer of the serous pleura, and then there is a visceral layer, and then there's a pericardial layer, and then there's a fibrous layer. Like there are many layers of the heart, okay? Just like how we were talking about the layers of the lungs, there are many layers to the heart, but in this scenario, they're not physiologically important to us, so we're not going to discuss them, okay? Just do realize that they are there. Now, since we're talking about the myocardium, very quickly, if you notice, what do you notice about the thickness of the wall of the left ventricle as compared to the wall of the right ventricle? Well, you'd notice that the wall of the left ventricle is much, much thicker, okay, meaning it's got more muscle as compared to the right ventricle. And there is a reason here. The reason is that the left ventricle has to pump blood to the entirety of your body, excluding the lungs, whereas the right ventricle only has to pump blood towards the lungs, which are, by the way, right beside it. So here's the lung, and here's the lung, okay? It would be literally right beside it. So it doesn't have to travel very far, so it doesn't need to generate as much power to push that blood. Whereas the left ventricle, it needs to bring blood to your little toe. So you can see how much of a distance that this blood needs to travel, and thus you need to generate lots of power. And thus we have a much thicker muscular wall on the left ventricle. Great. Now let's look at some of the characteristics of the venous and the arterial system. So with the venous system, it is a low pressure system, and my goodness, let me bring this back. So it is a low pressure system, and it has high volume. And we'll discuss what this means. And one of the main characteristics of veins is that they actually bring blood back to the heart. Okay? So they bring blood to the heart. Okay? Now, with respect to the arterial system is a high pressure system. High pressure system. And it is low volume. Okay? And it also brings blood away from the heart. So blood away from the heart. Awesome. Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing, guys. A lot of you may have heard that the arteries carry oxygenated blood and the veins carry deoxygenated blood, and that's the way you characterize these. And a lot of people will get confused when we talk about the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein, because the pulmonary artery, despite its name, is carrying deoxygenated blood, while the pulmonary vein, despite its name, is carrying oxygenated blood. So the best way to kind of characterize this is by this definition right here, that a vein brings blood back to the heart, and you can see the pulmonary vein is bringing blood towards the left ventricle, so it's bringing blood back to the heart, and the pulmonary artery is actually bringing blood away from the heart, so you can see that right there. That's the definition that I would go by if you want to avoid the confusion. Now, what do I mean by high volume and low volume? Okay, and what do I mean by high pressure and low pressure? So the venous system, this is the better example, is that it's high volume, meaning that it holds a lot of blood. I'm sure some of you may have heard, if you took any vascular class or something like that, that the venous circulation at any given point in time holds about 60 to 70% of your blood, okay? At any given point in time, it holds 60 to 70% of all of your blood, all right? And I won't get into it too much here. We'll touch on it in a little bit more detail in other videos, but the amount of blood that the heart is pumping out is around 5 liters. But when you start exercising, the demand of your muscles, for example, goes up for more blood, right? They need more blood because they need more oxygen. So the heart will start pumping out around 20 liters of blood. Where does that increase come from? How did we get more blood? How did we go from 5 liters at rest to 20 liters of blood being pumped out during exercise? Well, in short, it's coming from the veins. The veins are just a kind of storage place for our blood, okay? They hold our blood. That's what we mean by high volume. They hold a lot of blood. But they're also very low pressure, okay? And I won't get into this in any of the following videos. I'll talk about it in our vascular discussion, okay? Because it's just too complex to get into here. As opposed, the arterial side is high pressure, and it is low volume. Again, we won't talk about the pressure, but it's low volume because obviously it needs to bring blood to areas, thus it cannot hold on to that blood in and of itself. Okay, now let's take a quick look at the path of the blood, and then we'll take a look at this, which some of you may not have actually heard about. So the path of the blood, starting from the right ventricle, okay? We're going to start out from a deoxygenated blood and then oxygenate that blood, send it out to the rest of the body, okay? So here we go. The inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava bring blood to the right atrium. The blood from the right atrium has got to go through the tricuspid valve, which will then end up inside of the right ventricle. The right ventricle will then pump that blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary artery, which will then go towards the pulmonary circulation. That's important. It'll go to the pulmonary circulation. And the pulmonary circulation just refers to going to the lung and back, okay, from the heart. Now, after this blood goes to the pulmonary circulation, it'll get oxygenated, and the pulmonary veins, so these guy, and these guys, they will bring that blood back to the left atrium. The left atrium will then push that blood through the actual bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle will then pump that blood out through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta and to what's known as the systemic circulation. The systemic circulation refers to where the blood is going to the rest of the body and then back to the heart. Okay? That's the systemic circulation. So now we talked about how the lungs get their blood and how the rest of the body gets its blood. Okay? There is one more circulation, but we won't talk about that, and we'll talk about that next slide, but it's essentially how the heart gets its own blood. Okay? All right. Now, that was the path of the blood. Now let's kind of go back to that myocardium, that muscular wall of the heart. Let's take this guy right here, okay, and let's zoom in on it. If I zoom in on this wall here at a microscopic level, I'm going to see this cell, okay? I'm going to see this weird-looking, funky-looking cell, and this cell is called a cardiomyocyte, okay? So myo stands for muscle, cyte stands for cell, okay? So we know it's a muscle cell. Cardio stands for heart, so this is a heart muscle cell, okay? We have other muscle cells. You guys know we have smooth muscle cells and we have skeletal muscle cells. Now, if you take a look at this cardiomyocyte, you'll notice that just like skeletal muscle, it has multiple nuclei. Okay, it has multiple nuclei. So it is multinucleated. Okay, multinucleated. And just like skeletal muscle, you'll notice that it has these lines. These lines are called striations. Okay, which means that it also has what's known as a sarcomere. Okay, if you guys need a reminder about what a sarcomere is and all of that, I recommend going back and watching my skeletal muscle video when we talk about its structure and a little bit about the sarcomere. But these are some of the characteristics of it. But it's fundamentally different from skeletal muscle as well. As similar as it is pretty different. Unlike skeletal muscle, which is just a long straight tube, this guy is not a long straight tube. You can see that. You can see that it kind of just branches off, okay, and splits here and there, and then rejoins again with another fiber and all of that stuff. You can see that, okay? You can see it's almost as if like there's multiple myocytes stitched together. Okay, so what does that kind of look like, and what is holding them together? Well, it's this little region right here, this little zigzag line region. That has a special name. That's called an intercalated disc. But what does that mean? Let's take a closer look. Let's zoom in even more. If we zoom in even more, here's going to be an example right here. We're going to see one cardiac myocyte. Okay, so this cardiac myocyte represents this guy. And then the adjacent cardiac myocyte that's attached to it, which is this guy. Okay, well, what am I going to see? Right at the point where they're kind of attached, if you will, you'll see these two special molecules. Okay, these two special molecules. This one right here is called a desmosome. Now, a desmosome, if any of you ever took cell biology, is kind of like an adherence junction. Okay, it's an adherence junction, which means that it basically attaches two cells to one another. It makes them adhere to one another. It attaches these two cells to one another, okay? But you also see something else. You also see this guy right here. This guy is called a gap junction. Now, if you have watched my neuro video, you guys will remember that I talked about synapses, and I talked about chemical and electrical synapses. A gap junction allows for what we call an electrical synapse, okay? It provides a passage, or this nice little route, that ions from one cell can freely go down to an adjacent cell. What do I mean by this? So let's take a look. Let's say we have the sodium ion inside of this cardiac myocyte. Well, guess what? This sodium ion, because of the presence of this gap junction, can now actually find its way towards this adjacent cardiac myocyte, okay? And this is important. This is important because muscles require excitation in order to contract. You guys remember from skeletal muscle video that I talked about this, right? For example, they require a neuron, right, to come and actually innervate them and depolarize their membrane potential, meaning increase their membrane potential. And then this muscle will become excited and contract, right? That was skeletal muscle. Cardiac myocytes work a little bit differently, and we'll talk about this in future videos. But for now, I just want you to know that the presence of these gap junctions allows the flow of these ions. And this is important because if this cardiac myocyte becomes depolarized and its positive ions increase and it will contract, guess what happens? This positive ions will move towards the adjacent myocyte that's attached to it. Okay? And then that guy will contract. And then from here, it'll go to any other ones that are attached to it. This will cause a kind of synchronization of contraction to occur between all of the cardiac myocytes. And this right here is how we maintain and make sure that all of the heart, like the atria and the ventricle, contract at once, okay? Rather than, the left ventricle first contracting, then the right ventricle, then the thing. No, that's not how it works. Both of these guys contract in synchrony. And it's because of this presence of these gap junctions, okay? And something else, we'll talk about that. But do realize that when you see this term, intercalated disc, all it is referring to is the combination of the gap junction and a desmosome. Okay, the desmosome is just holding these two cells together, while the gap junction is providing a safe route for these ions to move from one cell to another. Okay, now let's go ahead and take a look at those valves that I was talking about, the heart valves. How does the blood move through them? Okay, how do they help with that process? And what do they kind of look like a bit more? Okay, so here is going to be all of your valves, every single one of them, okay? This is a transverse view. I'm sure you guys are familiar with a transverse view. So here what we're doing is we're actually cutting the heart right at this angle, and then we're flipping it to look at it from the top, from the bird's eye view. And here's what we're going to see. All of this redness is just going to be the myocardium of the heart. The myocardium of the heart. This orange stuff, don't worry about it too much, but it's just a fibrous tissue that is connecting all this stuff together. Don't worry about that. Okay? And we have these valves. How do you determine which valve is what? Okay. So this valve right here, it's got 3 little leaflets. So 1, 2, 3. Right? And you can see that separation very nicely there. Or 3 cusps. So we call this the tricuspid valve because it's got 3 cusps. Tricuspid valve. And if it's the tricuspid valve, guys, which side of the heart is this? This would be the right side of the heart, okay? What about this one? This one has 1 and 2 cusps. So we call this the bicuspid. The bicuspid valve, or the mitral valve, okay? But this is the bicuspid valve. Okay, what about these guys? Well, I've outlined them in red and blue for you so you can understand what this kind of looks like. So in blue is going to be the pulmonary semilunar valve, and red is going to be the aortic semilunar valve. And you notice something very special and different between the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve. And I will talk about that. I will talk about that in just a second. But first, I want to make sure you guys understand how blood moves through these valves, okay? First things first to understand is that all of these valves are one-way valves, meaning that the blood can only move in one direction from them. Let's take a scenario, this quick sketch I've gone ahead and drawn here, okay? This right here would be the left ventricle. This right here would be the left atria. This guy right here would be the pulmonary vein bringing blood to the left atrium. And this guy here would be the aorta, okay? Blood tends to follow down its pressure gradient, okay? blood flow. You guys remember Poiseuille's law that we talked about? Poiseuille's law says that flow equals to a change in pressure over resistance. Well, don't worry about resistance, but you can see how an increase in pressure increases flow. It's the same concept here, okay? The blood flow is dictated by the change in pressure, okay? So keeping with that idea in mind, we now know that blood actually flows through the heart and the cardiovascular system completely, okay, with changes in pressure. Now, another law that I want you to remember, and this was very important, is Boyle's law. Boyle's law. Boyle's law was P1 V1 equals to P2 V2, but the relationship there was if I increase the volume of in a given space, the pressure in that given space will go down. Okay, so let's write it like this. And if I decrease the volume in a given space, the pressure in there will go up. Remember this, okay? Because now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the pressures in the atria, the ventricle, and the aorta, and how this blood is going to be moving through them, and these pressures are going to be changing. And the valves, more importantly, how are they playing a role in this? Because remember, these valves are actually pressure operated. They open at pressure differences. So, let's grab my red right here. We have blood coming in to the actual left atrium. And the blood comes into the left atrium, guess what's going to happen? This is blood, by the way. The left atrium is going to get ready to contract, to push the blood into the ventricle. So it'll start contracting, okay? And once it contracts, you know what's going to happen to the left actual atria? You know what's going to happen to it? It's going to get smaller. It's going to get smaller in size. We'll take a look at it. Okay? It's going to get smaller in size because it's all squeezed up now. So once it gets smaller in size, you know what happens to these valves? Sorry, not these valves. You know what happens to the pressure inside? Well, we said as the volume in a given space decreases, the pressure in there increases. Okay. Now, for this, we need some hypothetical numbers. Let's say that the pressure inside of the ventricle at this current moment, right now, is 0. And the pressure in here, with all of this contracting, went from 0 to about 8. Okay? This pressure difference between the atria and the ventricle is enough to open up these valves. So these valves open. Okay? And this blood that was previously inside of the atria is now getting pushed out into the ventricle. So now look at it. This blood is now just sitting inside of the ventricle. And then you guys know that as we push the blood out, the atria no longer needs to contract, so it'll start to relax, actually. It'll start to relax. Okay? And once it's relaxing, guess what's going to happen, guys? Guess what's going to happen? It'll go back to that original shape, and once it does that, let's get rid of all this blood. The valves that were open due to the pressure difference will close now, because guess what? The pressure in here drops down to 0, and the pressure in here will change now. And we'll say to what in a second. But why did the valves close? Well, the valves closed because the pressure in the atria was no longer higher than the pressure in the ventricles. Okay? And again, why did the pressure in the atria get smaller? Because as it was relaxing, the volume was increasing and the pressure was then decreasing. It's just simple Boyle's law. So that's going to close these valves. And that makes sense because now guess what? Now that the blood's in the ventricle is going to get ready to contract, okay? And once the ventricle contracts, guys, what's going to happen to it? Its size is going to get smaller. I'm not going to redraw it. But its size will get smaller, and the pressure in here, inside of this actual ventricle, will increase because its volume is getting smaller. And guess what? It's going to go to about, let's say, 120. And the pressure in the aorta is about 80. Okay? Is about 80 at this point in time. Now, very quickly, by the way, do you guys think that if the pressure in here, inside of the ventricle, was 0, and the pressure in the aorta was 80, would this valve open? Would this aortic semilunar valve open? If you're saying no, then pat yourself on the back. You're absolutely correct. It would not open. The pressure inside of the ventricle has to exceed the pressure of the aorta in order for this valve to open. So it does. It goes to 120, and then guess what? Guess what? This valve opens up, and we start pushing all of this blood that was in here into that actual aorta. And the pressure in the aorta will now increase. Okay? Pressure in the aorta will now increase into, I don't know, let's say about 120. And the pressure inside of the ventricle, now that it's pushed all of the blood out, will go to 0, or start going to 0, because then it'll start to relax. Okay? It'll start to relax and increase its volume, thus decreasing the pressure inside. Okay? And if that occurs, what's going to happen to these valves, guys, these aortic semilunar valve? They're going to snap back closed. Okay? Snap back closed. That's how blood moves through these valves. Okay? It's just through a difference of pressure gradients. Okay? And blood always moves down its pressure gradient. And remember that this is all a one-way valve. Okay? All one-way valves. All right. Now, to get back to this difference between the aortic semilunar and the pulmonary semilunar, once we push this blood out, guys, okay, you know some of it will actually go this way, right? But a tiny amount of it will actually leak back and collect inside of the actual cusps or leaflets, if you will, of the actual aortic semilunar valve. So look, let's get rid of that pressure. Some of it will go, to the rest of the body. Some of it, though, will fall back, okay, and collect over here. So let's show that. Here's some of that blood that is kind of just collecting inside of those little leaflets. Inside of those leaflets, this aortic semilunar valve leaflets, there is a very special and cool anatomical feature. There are these little holes, and these little holes on both sides are actually attached to specific arteries. And these arteries are known as your coronary arteries. Why coronary? Because they're feeding the heart, okay? These coronary arteries are the blood supply that actually brings blood to the heart itself. Because remember, in the previous slide, we talked about the systemic circulation, where we bring blood to everywhere else in the body. Then we talked about the pulmonary circulation, where we actually bring blood to the lungs. But now we got to talk about the actual coronary circulation, okay? And the coronary circulation involves these coronary arteries. And notice the irony here. Notice the irony here that the rest of the body is receiving its blood, including the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circulation. They're receiving their blood when the heart is contracting, but the heart itself is actually receiving the majority of its blood when it's relaxing. Well, how do we know that it's relaxing? Because at this point, it will have pumped the blood out, the ventricle will start to relax, and the blood, some of it will come and collect in that little leaflet, and then after it's collecting that little leaflet, it'll kind of leak into that little hole, okay, right over there in this hole, and go towards these arteries, these coronary arteries that will just keep branching and feeding the actual cardiac tissue, okay? So that's fascinating. That's fascinating indeed. And again, you'll see that approximately about 80% of the heart's blood is coming through its relaxation phase, and about 20% in its contracted state, okay? And there are reasons for that, because in its contracted state, for example, all these coronary arteries are extremely squeezed, right? Because these coronary arteries, they're not just outside, right? They're in between the actual musculature, and when the musculature contracts, they're squeezing and actually collapsing these arteries so that no blood can flow through them. But as soon as they relax, not only does blood fill in here, but it can actually go through the actual artery because there's no longer a contraction collapsing these vessels. Pretty awesome. At least I think so. Now, that's going to be it with the anatomy of the heart and the blood flow and how the valves work, okay? So in the next video, guys, we're going to start talking about the intrinsic cardiac conduction mechanism. Okay, and what that means is that the heart is able to beat in and of its own accord without the action of the nervous system at all. So, meaning the heart can contract without any nervous input, and we'll see how that is. If you guys liked the video, if you learned something from it, if it was truly helpful, please like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.